big mama of them all, the big mistake, which is pride. And I refer to pride as a landmine because I think it can be so destructive in our lives. It can really, I've seen it ruin people's relationships with God. I've seen it ruin people's careers. I've seen it ruin people's marriages. I've seen it affect community life. I've seen it affect family life. I mean, pride is at the root of so many problems within our relationships or interactions with other people. Back when I was 16 years old, let me just open with a story first. Back when I was 16 years old, this was in my BC days, my before Christ days, and I was in a high school competition to see how many things I could sell, and I was, as some might guess, I was a bit of a competitive person back then. Some things don't change. But I was going from house to house, and I came to this one house, and this one guy, you know, he bought something for me, and he says, "Oh, skip that guy's house next door. He won't buy anything." And I was like thinking, I'm like, 2 other people told me like skip this guy's house. So I was like, you know what? Let me just go to his house anyway. And so I went to his house, and he opened up the door, and you know, he started saying, "What are you selling?" And he was really like giving me all the signs he's not going to sell. And I was a little bit frustrated, and I said to him, you know, I said, "Oh, well, yeah, it's okay. Your neighbors all pretty much told me that you weren't going to buy from me anyway. And that, you know, you couldn't afford this stuff anyway, and like you're, you know." And so like, I goes, "Let me see what you got here." And he ended up writing me a big fat check for a bunch of things. So I was like, "I want something here." So I went to the next guy's house, and I was like, I was gonna skip your house because your neighbors told me that you and man, I won that sales competition because of pride. Because people wanted to like prove their neighbors wrong. All the neighbors said, "You can't afford it," so you're like, "I'm gonna prove these guys wrong and show what I can do." Pride is powerful. Pride will move people to do things that they normally wouldn't do. And I think in our spiritual lives, a lot of times we start our relationship, our journey with God with good beginnings, bright beginnings, okay? Like little children, we're growing and we're learning and we're happy and we're smiling, we're playing nice in the sandbox with other people, and we're focused, we're laser focused on God. Our focus is set on God. We're in prayer, we're in devotion, our life is good. But without warning, pride begins to set in. And it prevents us from being all I believe that God desires for us to be. And it tempts us to believe that we know better than He does. And if left unchecked, pride can alter our attitude towards God and towards others. We're going to be talking about the slippery slope of pride. How it is that it can start real small and balloon into something real big. Now, I got to tell you, in the last decade or so, I've seen a lot of people who started off their relationships with God real good. And you see this and you're like, man, these people are serving, and they're reading, and they're coming to church, and they're worshiping, and things are great. But then pride starts slipping. And this person who was laser focused ends up slipping away from God. Proverbs chapter 8 verse 13 tells us that the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Pride and arrogance and the evil way and the perverse mouth I hate. Sometimes in the workplace we refuse to admit that we're part of the problem. Someone said it during the discussion group, like there's a conflict at work. Someone close to me, it's always someone else's fault. Always someone else's fault. They're never at fault. They get to a point now where like they know better than everyone else. And it all starts with pride. But the thing here with pride is that it doesn't stop at pride. Pride moves to arrogance. And so the proverb tells us here that the issue starts with pride, thinking that we're better than someone else, putting ourselves above God's will, and never willing to admit our failure. But then it grows into that second stage, which is arrogance. And arrogance is insisting that we are always right. Arrogance is like it's the concept of self-important where, so one of my friends said it to me this was back in college. They said, I don't know how to put this. We're like in the middle of an argument, okay? She's like, I don't know how to put this to you. And I was like, I thought there was like a bomb about to come, okay? A really good friend of mine. And she says, but I'm a pretty big deal. And I was like, and I was so irritated. Because arrogance is one of those things that you're just like, you're irritated by. Like someone said about that basketball guy that I don't even like mentioning his name at times, right? Like something about arrogance is really, it irritates you. It's under your skin a little bit, okay? But he says it doesn't start and stop with pride or arrogance, but it continues onto an evil lifestyle. He says put away, he says pride and arrogance and evil ways. Because the reality is a lot of times it starts with pride, putting ourselves above God. Then it goes to arrogance, thinking that we're the center of the world and we're always right. But then it leads to an evil lifestyle. We begin to live differently. We begin to fall into sin. We begin to fall into habits that destroy our relationships that are the most precious relationships. Our relationships with our spouses, our parents, our siblings, co-workers, and ultimately with God. But then ultimately, it leads, that last step, he says, and the perverse mouth. Because after all that, we'll still end up, even though these relationships are being destroyed and we're falling into sin, we'll then begin to curse others and begin to curse God. And so he says it starts with pride, but it doesn't stop with pride. It snowballs in something much bigger. Today we're going to be looking at the story of King Uzziah. If you have your Bibles, please open up to 2 Chronicles chapter 26. Because we're going to be doing a study of Uzziah. And we're going to look at how Uzziah started off really good. But how his life kind of snowballed into something real sad. Real sad state. Okay? So 2 Chronicles 26 verse 3. It begins that Uzziah was 16 years old when he became a king, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. So we have this young kid. You can think of Uzziah as starting his journey with Christ. If you will, if we want to frame it within our context of living as the body of Christ, God is inviting him, saying, you are coming to rule with me as a king from a young age. Like when we begin our Christian journey, we got to understand something, that when we become Christians, when we walk as Christians, when we live as Christians, when we become part of the body of Christ, we receive this inheritance as being part of the kingdom. And God tells us in the book of Revelation that we will sit on his throne, to the right of his throne. Which means that we receive the ability to reign with God. To become kings and queens with God. And so at a young age, Uzziah, if you will, he begins his life with God, reigning with God. And he reigns for 52 years in Jerusalem. Verse 4 tells us, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father Amaziah had done. He saw God in the days of Zechariah. So Zechariah is the prophet. If you guys are familiar, there's 5 major prophets and 12 minor prophets. Zechariah is one of the minor prophets. And Zechariah is the prophet at the time of Uzziah. He sought God in the days of Zechariah, who had understanding in the visions of God. And as long as he sought the Lord, God made him prosper. So you have this young man who is walking with God. He is reigning with God. He is doing the will of God. He is seeking a relationship with God. And as long as he's seeking that relationship with God, God is prospering his life. In other words, as long as we seek a relationship with God, we are going to find this spiritual and heavenly prosperity coming into our lives. In other words, there will be fruit in our lives. I'm not talking about the prosperity of walk with Jesus and you will drive a Bentley, okay? Or walk with Jesus and you're going to get a big fat house. But when we walk with God, what we'll find is that our lives will begin to bear fruit of the gospel. And that the Spirit will begin to bear fruit in our lives. And so when St. Paul tells us that the fruit of the Spirit is love and joy and peace and goodness, you're like, but I'm not a good person, or I'm not a kind person. Well, what happens with Uzziah is as soon as he starts living with God and seeking God, his life is transformed. And his life is prospered. Early in his days, in verse 6 to verse 7, actually verse 6 to 15 talks about the early walk. But specifically in verses 6 and 7, we find that he made war against the old sins. And the specific people that are mentioned are the Philistines. In other words, he is fighting those old sinful habits in his life that he struggled with. That means when he was a young man, maybe he struggled with pornography, but he is fighting it. Maybe when he was a young person, he was struggling with gossiping and lying, but he fought against it. He struggled against these things, and he had victory, people. Like, when we walk with Christ, when we live a relationship with God, we will find victory over sin. And so we have this young man who is having victory against the old sins. It says he broke down the wall of Gath. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 4 tells us that there was this person from the city of Gath. Okay? Anyone familiar with 1 Samuel 17 knows that this is the story of David and Goliath. And so you have this ginormous human being called Goliath who's coming after the people of God, and David goes out to fight him. And so he begins to break down. It says he broke down the wall of Gath. In other words, this oath, like he was overmatched, but he still found victory. There were sins, if you will, in his life that he could have never imagined having victory over because he was so overmatched, but he found victory. He was seeking God in his life. He also went against those in the city of Gerbal. And the Gerbal is, it's the dwelling of Baal, which were the idols in his life. And if you remember, we talked about certain idols in our lives, like money and power and even self-image and these things. And so these things he begins to tear down in his life. Man, this man is seeking God. He's walking with God. He is humbling himself before God. King Uzziah, at this point you would say, this is a good king. This is a good man. And then he also went against a group called the Muanites. And the word Muanim means habitations. In other words, these were the sins that were dwelling within that nobody else knew about. And he's finding victory over this. King Uzziah was growing spiritually. King Uzziah was growing as a man of God, as a person, a child of God. And as a result of that, what happens is people begin to hear about these victories. Verse 8 tells us that his fame spread as far as the entrance of Egypt, for he became exceedingly strong. People begin to hear about what is happening in his life. Now, many of us know people, when God does a work in that person's life, and their life begins to transform, everyone's like, but isn't that, let me just pick a very common Egyptian name, Mina? Okay? Or isn't that Mark? Right? Isn't that Mary? Isn't that the same person that I remember from back in the day? And it says, and people were talking about it. His fame spread. Now, people were like, what is God doing in this person's life? People hear about his growth. And it doesn't stop there. He goes on in verse 9. It says, and Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem at the corner gate, at the valley gate, at the corner buttress of the wall. Then he fortified them. In other words, he begins to strengthen his spiritual life. As you read the book of Nehemiah, you realize that the wall is so critical because that wall is there to protect. And it's there to fortify and to strengthen. And so what's happening with Uzziah is he says, I am committing my life to God. I'm coming to be a child of God. I'm getting rid of the sin in my life. I'm not going to let people's thinking about me distract me. I'm going to continue strengthening my life with God. But he doesn't stop there either. In verse 10 it tells us, and he also built towers in the desert. He dug many wells, for he had much livestock, both in the lowlands and in the plains. He also had farmers and vine dressers in the mountains and in Carmel, for he loved the soil. In other words, he found life where there was no life. His life is bearing fruit, people. His service to God begins to bear fruit, because in the very next section, in verse 11, it tells us that, moreover, Uzziah had an army of fighting men who went out to war by companies, that made war with mighty men to help the king against the armies. And it tells us in verse 12 that he had 2,600 chief officers and 307,500 people in his army. I mean, this man was leading people. And you could say that he is a type of person that is leading others to Christ. At this point, you would say, man, I want to be like Uzziah. Uzziah is coming to God. He's reigning with God. His life is bearing fruit. He's having victory over sin. He's strengthening his life. He's leading others to God. And it says he doesn't stop there. In verse 14 it says that Uzziah prepared them for the entire army, shields, spears, helmets, body armor, bows, and slings to cast stones. If you're familiar with Ephesians chapter 6, it talks about the army. I mean the armor of God. Thank you. The armor of God. And so this armor is put on in order to be prepared for battle. And so what Uzziah is now doing, he's not just leading people to Christ, leading people to God. He's saying, I'm going to equip you also. I'm going to give you what you need. I mean, this man's life. You would say, this guy, God, like, man, like, where are the Uzziahs amongst us today? But unfortunately with Uzziah, as with many people, pride comes before the fall. Pride comes before the fall. Proverbs chapter 16 verse 18 tells us that pride goes before destruction or before the fall. Sometimes what happens is people begin to think more than is reality. And this is what happens with King Uzziah. He's doing all of this great stuff for God. And then in verse 16 it says, but when he was strong, his heart was lifted up. When he was strong, his heart was lifted up. He began to look at himself and say, man, whew, I am that special. He began to say, let me tell you something. I'm a big deal. I'm a pretty big deal. His heart was lifted up. And it says it was lifted up to his destruction. For he transgressed against the Lord his God by entering the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. His heart was lifted up. He began to think he did not need God any longer. So he's walking with God. God is blessing him. He's reigning with God. He's bearing fruit in his life. He's becoming stronger. He's leading others to Christ. He is equipping people. And then he says, wait, I'm good. I can do this. I got this thing down now. Many people become professional ministers. Professional servants. And they get this whole ministry thing down like very professionally. And this is what begins to happen with Uzziah. He says, I got this thing down. I'm good. I'm good. And I think what happens with Uzziah is he quits. He quits doing the things that he was once doing. That was helping him. That was the cause of bearing fruit in his life. And he begins, I believe, one of those things that I see in our lives as Christians that causes us to fall, so to speak, to have our hearts lifted up. And what happens when our hearts get lifted up is we begin to drift from our time of devotion. Like people that I know that were just regular, you could not take them away from their morning time of devotion. You could not take these people away from their morning time. These people would wake up at 4:30 in the morning if they had to pray, to spend time with God, before going to work, before their kids and their spouse would wake up. You could not break them of this habit. And he begins to drift from his time of devotion. And as soon as that happens, pride come forth. Okay? And at a certain point with Uzziah, it doesn't just drift, he breaks out into all-out rebellion. And it says that it led to his destruction, for he transgressed against the Lord his God by entering the temple. In other words, this word transgress means that he acted unfaithfully. When we think of acting unfaithfully in a relationship, we think of cheating on another person. We think of breaking a vow. We think of committing adultery. And from God's perspective, this is exactly what's going on with Uzziah. He begins to fall into pride, assuming that there is no action beyond his limits. He doesn't realize at that time that he is... So from the time of Adam until the time of Christ, there is no one person where you have a king, a priest, and a prophet in one person. Okay? It's not until Christ that Christ restores, and Ephraim the Syrian tells us this in the 4th century, he uses beautiful language. He talks about how Christ comes in order to restore the kingly role, the priestly role, the prophetic role. But in the Old Testament, you find that there is division amongst the roles. And what happens with King Uzziah is he begins as the king to say, I'd like to do the priestly role as well. Well, why not? Like, that looks pretty good. And so he goes in order to do the priestly role. And 1 Samuel chapter 13 tells us also that this was the action that led to Saul's demise. So this is not something new. I mean, Uzziah does it, but one of the very first king, actually, that was the reason that he fell as well. He says, I think that looks good as well. I'm not satisfied, in other words, with what God has given me. I want someone else's role. I want someone else's responsibility. He begins to covet that which is not his own. He's no longer content with what God has given him. You would say, well, he's the king. Maybe like someone should have said something to him. Maybe someone did say something to him. All right? Verse 17. So Azariah the priest went in after him, and with him were 80 priests. Like, I want you to imagine, you're the king, and 81 priests walk in, and they confront you. And that is probably a bit of an uncomfortable scene. Like, I kind of imagine if I was confronted by a sea of priests, I would be a little bit uncomfortable. And it says they were valiant men. In other words, these were courageous men. They were willing to go boldly and to speak to the king. And they withstood King Uzziah and said to him, it is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary. You have trespassed. You shall have no honor from the Lord God. In other words, this man was confronted. One of you said it during our time of discussion. You said that part of the problem with pride is that even when we are confronted, we ignore it. We think we've got it figured out. And so he's confronted, and the next verse tells us that he insisted on what was in his mind. Uzziah became furious. He had a censer in his hand to burn incense. He was like, I'm going to do this. Doesn't matter what you tell me to do or not to do. He was like my 2-year-old, who I tell him no, and he kind of gives me that look, and he says, no, Daddy. This is King Uzziah. He's a 2-year-old. Tell him, no, you shouldn't do that. And he says, no, Daddy. And he runs away and does it. Anyway, this is what King Uzziah does. This is what pride looks like. You are confronted by someone, and you become angry. We've been in those situations before, folks. Maybe we've been on the getting angry side. Maybe we've been on the confronting side. Maybe we've been on the observing the confrontation. And you're like, why is that person getting angry? Like, wouldn't you want, like, I always think, like, I'd want someone to tell me if I was doing something wrong. Like, confront me. Tell me. Talk to me. But when we get angry, what it does is it puts us on an island. And this ultimately leads to a great demise for King Uzziah. I think four things happen to King Uzziah. Number one is that it affects his health. It says, and while he was angry with the priests, leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priests in the house of the Lord beside the incense altar. In other words, there were psychosomatic casualties that he began to experience in his own life. Sometimes we think like it's a spiritual thing. But let me tell you that sometimes spiritual matters can affect our physical health as well. Sometimes when I feel I have removed myself from God, the burden of being apart from God, of knowing that I have been removed, like I'm not in communion with God, sometimes it can affect me physically. Sometimes. Okay? Sometimes I can feel so disconnected from God that it makes me feel depressed and it makes me feel like I just want to sleep. We'll begin to get twitches in our eyes. Okay? Sometimes stress of being out of relationship with God can affect our physical health as well as our emotional health. Number two is it affects our relationships with others. It says that Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked at him, and there on his forehead he was leprous, so they thrust him out of the place. In other words, the word that was used during discussion was he became isolated. Pride isolates us. He became removed from the rest of the community. Number three, King Uzziah was a leper until the day of his death. In verse 21, he dwelt in an isolated house because he was a leper. He was cut off from the house of the Lord. In other words, it affects our worship. Pride affects our health. It affects our relationship with others. It affects our worship. And lastly, pride can be a very defining characteristic of our legacy. Uzziah rested with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the field of burial which belonged to the king. For they said, he is a leper. That's what he was known as. He wasn't known as the guy that at the beginning of his life did all those things. Y'all still remember that King Uzziah that I was describing at the beginning. You're like, well, what happened to that guy? Where did he go? We want that Uzziah back. We want to find that guy again. But that's how he was defined. That's how his legacy was defined. Because of his pride. I just came from a funeral. It was in Detroit. And as I was listening to this woman's life described, I was thinking to myself, what a legacy. This woman was a humble woman that served God, served her husband, her children, served people in Africa, served the prostitutes here, served the prostitutes in Detroit. I mean, this woman was a servant. And as a result, she was a servant leader. And that was her legacy. That's what she'll be remembered as. Uzziah, remembered because of his pride. That was his legacy. That's what he will be forever remembered as. I think it's so critical that we understand that we are going to have to struggle against pride. Every one of us. This is a personal fight that we will struggle. There's several reasons why people can fall victim to pride. Perhaps self-centeredness, perhaps feelings of inadequacy, emotional immaturity, or inability to handle responsibility. Sometimes we're just unprepared for success. Like I know folks that so much has been laid in front of them. Perhaps at a young age, at 16 years old, he wasn't prepared for it. She wasn't prepared for it. Okay? So there's a number of things that can lead towards pride. Some of the indications of struggling with pride: bragging. Do we ever hang out with braggers? Braggers are never like an enjoyable person to be around, right? Bragging, that's a sign of pride. There's a reason. Like people don't, it's not a desirable, pride is not a desirable quality. Like we look at humility, we're like, wow, Jesus Christ. Like you think of the most humble person, you think of Christ. You think of Philippians 2, he humbled himself to the point of death, even the death of the cross. He allowed himself to be humiliated on the cross. Okay? Never bragged. Never walked around and said, hey, let me tell you who my daddy is. Alright? Bragging, selfishness, lack of submission to authority. And I would say the fruit of pride, probably the biggest result of all that, fruit of pride is shame. Proverbs 11 tells us that when pride comes, then comes shame. lot of times, like when we're prideful, we feel ashamed of ourselves. We feel ashamed of things that we do. We're not really satisfied with who we are. Like sometimes you think of a prideful person as someone who walks around patting themselves on the back, feeling great about themselves. A lot of times, prideful people feel like this small. They feel really small. They feel tiny. These big pitfalls, these big mistakes, like the rest of them, the other 6, are avoidable and correctable, but with proper awareness, orientation, and effort. I'm going to give you a very simple solution for this morning. Simple solution is that we need to be willing to embrace our limits. Okay? We need to be willing to embrace who we are, our limits before God, our limits within this world, our limits within our marriages, our limits within work, our limits within our community life. We need to be willing to embrace our limits. Because sometimes we say, well, I'll take that on, I'll do that, I can do that, I'm fine, yeah, I'll do it. We need to be willing to embrace the limits and slow down a little bit. This is not a talk about slowing down, this is a talk about embracing limits. Okay? I think a lot of times what happens is we are unprepared for, like, we don't grow into something. We can start here and we want to jump all the way over here. We need to be willing to grow and embrace. Now, we need to be willing to grow. And when we look at King Uzziah's life, we're like, man, that guy was growing. And I want to challenge the community this morning to be willing to grow. Like, we need to be willing to exercise some effort and orient ourselves to God so that we can grow. Like, trust me, folks, I want a bunch of King Uzziahs here. I want people who are growing in the relationship with Jesus Christ. I want people who are here who are leading others to Christ, who are equipping others for Christ. But we need to also be willing to embrace that we ourselves have limits. Overcoming pride by embracing our limits. I'm going to give you 5 things to think about when it comes to embracing our limits, and we'll close with that. The first one is that we need to be willing to adopt, or not willing, we need to adopt a correct view of God and of what God and who God has called us to be. When our view of God gets corrected, oftentimes what that does is it fixes our view of ourselves. Because if we have a wrong view of God, sometimes it distorts our view of who we are. Okay? So we want to start with correcting our view of God, who God is, and what God is calling from us as His people. Okay? Number 2 is we need to repent of our sin. And when we talk about pride, this is probably the big one that many of us struggle with, is repenting of our sin. It's being willing to come and say, I am going to turn away from my sin to God and seek the help in order to do so. That means I'm willing to come and confess to God in the presence of a priest and receive some guidance in order to grow. And to be willing to repent. And this requires a bit of humility from us. To accept that we don't have to have this image that we always thought that we had to have. This is not an easy thing to do. Number 3 is that we need to flee temptation. To embrace limits means that we flee temptation and we don't say, yeah, but I'm okay, I can be around that. When I first started my journey with Christ many years ago, I knew I had to flee certain places. I knew I had to flee certain relationships, certain friendships. Not because these people or places were necessarily bad, some of them were, okay, truth be told, but it was really an issue of me. I needed to flee temptation. There were certain things that I needed to stop doing just because I needed to flee temptation. Okay? Wasn't going to play around the place of temptation and then be upset when I fell. Like that would have been dumb from my side. So I said, no, I need to flee from temptation. I need to avoid that. Number 4, and this is going to be a big one, is that we've got to be willing to be committed to our devotional time. We've got to get recommitted, folks. King Uzziah, I believe, was a man initially who was probably very committed in his relationship with God. And if we go all the way back, we find this guy who was reigning with God, who was living with God, who was leading others to God, who was equipping others for God, who was strengthening his life with God. And I think a big part of it was he was devoted. He was devoted. devotion does not mean that while I'm cooking, I'm praying. Or that while I'm on the treadmill, I'm praying. You can do those, you can pray during those times, that's fine. God bless, like, you can pray while doing anything. But devotion literally means that we stop everything and devote some time to God. That we get still. Devotion is not, man, I'm running late for work, so I'll just pray on my way to work. Okay? Or I really love, and there's nobody here that loves morning sleep more than I do. Like, I was so happy this morning. I was so happy, folks. Like, I really wish every Sunday could be daylight saving. Like, I wish I could gain an hour of sleep every Sunday morning. Like, that would be the best thing in the world. Okay? But, like, that means that we've got to get up even if we're not morning people. Okay? And devote some time to God. Fifth and final, and this is not an exciting one, but I'm going to put it out there anyway. We've got to be willing to accept humiliation at times. That means that what I mean by humiliation is that means that we need to be willing that when someone confronts us or calls us out, the reason why we get upset is because we feel humiliated. No, like, nobody likes being humiliated. But we know the one who accepted to be humiliated for our sake. I mean, tell me a more humiliating way to die than the cross. You can't tell me. Like, today we glory in the cross. 2,000 years later. In St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he was talking about how people were ridiculing the cross. He says, we glory in that cross. The cross is humiliating. For us to break our pride, we've got to be willing to say, man, I'm going to be willing to be confronted at times. I'm going to be willing to be challenged by my spouse at times, by my coworkers at times, by my priest at times, by my parishioners at times. I'm going to be willing to be challenged and be made fun of at times if it means humbling myself before God. Okay? I am praying for some King Uzziahs in this place. And some queens as well. Alright? My heart, this whole week I've been praying, I'm like, God, please, we need to embrace our limits so that you can work in our midst. I've been praying for God to send people here, not just to be here and worship and we have a good discussion. This is good. I've been praying, I'm like, God, please, we want to build some people. I want to see people growing and strengthening their relationship with God and getting devoted in a deeper walk with God. And ultimately leading others to Christ and strengthening those people for Christ. Let's spend these next few days really praying about that as a community. And really focusing on embracing our limits. Any questions?